Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 54 of Series 9. The question for today is, what is justice? Is it objective or a human idea that we can't do without? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 5. So in these workshops, I'm advocating a principle of value as a way of dealing with the central issues of life. These are issues in the area of, but not limited to, religion, ethics, aesthetics, meaning and purpose. And I've argued that the concept of value is central to understanding these activities. For example, in religion, God is the believer's highest conceivable value, together with a pantheon of other values. A meaningful life is also a worthwhile and valuable life, lit up by values. And ethical principles are values that guide moral action. So in practice, as well as in fundamental ontology, the concept of value explains these kinds of human activity. And today I am applying this analysis to the idea of justice and the related notion of human rights. I can do this because justice and rights are not only values, but on Aristotle's notion of justice as a virtue, they are also value states. That is, if you take out their value content, they no longer exist as justice or rights. That is, they become only facts or principles explaining social relations. So the question of whether values or justice and rights are objective becomes crucially significant. In my view, as well as that of others, such as John Rawls, values are subjective, not objective. But objectivity can mean a lot of different things, like universality, ontological independence, mind independence, social agreement, consensus, supervenience, or inescapability. Bearing these different definitions of objectivity in mind, we can first look at some objective theories of justice. Yet before that, we should at least outline some arguments about the objectivity of value and values. And later we'll look at some metaphysical, social, psychological and biological theories of justice. But I'll conclude with a subjective value theory of justice, drawing on virtue theory. John Rawls argues that there are no objective values, but he isn't just arguing against normative values. Normative values imply some kind of regulative order or coherence. He means that values do not have ontologically substantive existence in the fabric of the world. Yet Rawls gives us three main arguments that there are no objective values. 1. The direction of dependence is mistakenly reversed by making the desire depend upon the goodness. 2. His argument from queerness is that objective values would have an untenable quasi-objective status. And 3. He points to the psychological propensity of the mind to spread itself on external objects, noted by Freud. And I agree with Rawls, but on the grounds that values can't exist independently without a conscious human agent. Yet there are also some other problems with the idea of what would be pre-existing objective values. These include human variability, diversity, and cultural relativity that implies ethical relativity. Conversely, Plato's concept of justice was based on his theory of objective and immutable forms. As well as that, true knowledge is certain knowledge like that of the geometry of circles and squares. Plato also argues that moral forms such as justice and beauty are knowable in the same way, and he holds that justice is defined by the essence or eternal form of mankind, and justice is attained by conformity with that eternal human essence. Plato names three aspects of human nature as the appetitive, the spirited aspect of reflective passions, and reason. And although these three aspects were to be lived in harmony, he prioritized reason in order to give order to the others. But my first criticism is the failure of his rationalism to be in harmony with these other aspects. And in my view, Plato's underlying concepts are so untenable as to make his theory of justice implausible. These concepts are: 1. A parallel world of forms; 2. That these forms are absolute and unchanging; 3. That they are representations of everything, including the infinite possibilities of the future; 4. That knowledge can be defined in this absolute way; 5. That such can represent justice; and 6. That, like Kant, knowledge of these things compel compliance. Yet Plato argued not only from a rationalist ontology, but from also the alternative of an anarchic relativity. But applied ethics in the modern world has shown remarkable consensus without such underlying absolutes. Yet this isn't to say that underlying normative principles can't be found, and in my view they have been found in principles of value that I advocate. My objective above, however, was to criticise the kind of objectively based justice that Plato sets out. Yet, notwithstanding Plato's theory of political justice, there's another criticism of his idea of justice. That is, his criteria of justice are internal to an ontology and largely omit what is essential to justice. That is, what is omitted is whatever is judged to be the fair treatment of individuals or people. We will get onto that judgment of fairness shortly. But Plato handles the question of social treatment of people by applying his same primacy of reason. That is, philosopher kings rule by reason, spirit is given by the military, and workers satisfy the appetitive. More circumspectly, Aristotle held that as a complete virtue, justice was always in relation to another person. We should note that justice was one of the four main virtues, together with temperance, prudence, and courage. And for both Plato and Aristotle, virtue is a matter of disposition and excellence of character. Also in the Greek world, the virtue of justice doesn't emphasize concerns that don't have consequences for the polis. And we can ask later if this rather asocial conception of justice is an oversight or a useful insight. We can also ask here if the literal meaning of justification offers clues to understanding the asocial idea of justice. In the context of ethics, justification means to determine or make something right, good, or give it integrity. Yet justification can also describe anything thought to be right, whole, independent, or complete. For example, justification can also describe the edges of a text or the accuracy of a theory, and this meaning gives sense to the idea of justice as something right or true. There are also different ways by which something can be justified. For example, by reason, by outcome, by fiat, by God, or aesthetically. Yet this consideration introduces one of the ways in which justice might be argued to be a subjective social construct. That is, there are many kinds of justice, like social, moral, legal, retributive, restorative, and procedural justice. Procedural justice is about how fairly people are treated. Retributive justice is about punishment. And both this variety and novelty suggest that they are anthropocentric constructions. And their subjectivity is underlined by the idea that strict notions of justice have been thought, even by classical thinkers like Aquinas, to need tempering with mercy, love, compassion, and forgiveness. And punitive justice has also been regarded as a way of masking a psychological need for revenge. We will take a closer look at such humanist and psychological observations later. Yet humanist and psychological considerations prompt the question, where does the judgment of justice come from? This is a question that we can answer without prejudice in the conclusion of this study. Yet I can clarify it here by restating 5 kinds of things that are thought to have value in themselves. These were physical objects, abstract principles, human actions, mental states, or conscious beings like people. Concerning these, I've already outlined Mackie's general argument that there are no objective values. Yet relevant here is that Mackie's rejection of objective values includes intrinsic values. He writes that something or other is intrinsically desirable, objectively good, has been undermined by the rejection of all objective values, unquote. Ralph Perry also argued that values don't exist until someone desires something. And these arguments have consequences for the value of objects, principles, actions, mental states, and people. That is, on the view above, as an abstract principle or human action, justice could not have value in itself, and that its value must be derived from the human choices produced by certain mental states. The Aristotelian notion of justice as a dispositional virtue now becomes more significant. This is because justice will be derived from human judgment, not its intrinsic value. I've discussed objective and intrinsic value in their respective podcasts, and I won't be doing so again here. But I should also briefly mention some thinkers who do believe in such objective values. Robert Nozick, for example, believes in objective and intrinsic values that support unalienable rights. He writes, individuals have rights, and there are things no person or group may do to them. Other thinkers who believe in such intrinsic values include Aristotle, G.E. Moore, Dworkin, Nozick, Parfit, and Nagel. And incredibly, Parfit believes that objects like books and rational activity can have intrinsic value. Dworkin extends this view by saying that paintings and great trees can have intrinsic value. I'm not going to argue against these views again here, but with similar effect, we can look at some views that don't accept the objectivity of justice. Isaiah Berlin, for example, takes a pluralist view that values like justice don't necessarily have primacy over others. That is, there isn't a single universal table on which you can place these values in a definite hierarchy. Yet he accepts that in practice some values can be legitimately ranked above others. There are a number of consequences of Berlin's value pluralism. One is his view that not all the supreme values of mankind are compatible, and another is that we cannot always morally judge other cultures of different times. On the potential incompatibility of human goods or values, Berlin reminds us that freedom or liberty must be weighed against many other values, such as equality or justice or happiness or security or public order." Unquote. This is illustrated in his classical work Two Concepts of Liberty. Another consequence of Berlin's pluralism is that we can't morally judge other cultures of different times. He writes that there can be no superstandard for the comparison of entire scales of value, which itself derives from no specific set of beliefs and no one specific culture. This means that we cannot say that one concept of justice is definitely better than another. Berlin says this because cultures are different, their values are different, and their internal criteria are different. And it can't be maintained that we are in a privileged position to judge at the end of human progress. In his celebrated book, A Theory of Justice, John Rawls attempts a resolution in terms of distributive justice. This is posed as an alternative to utilitarianism that even Mill admitted can't account for justice. Rawls held that a just society respects people's rights to choose their own goals and values, but there still remains a problem of how to fairly distribute wealth and resources. To do this, Rawls proposed establishing principles and practices of fairness from behind a veil of ignorance. That is, principles will be chosen by people without knowing their places in the social order or their benefits. 7 experiments with 6,000 participants showed that this leads to choices that favour the greater good. The studies indicate that veil of ignorance reasoning promotes impartial decision making. But the veil of ignorance may not resolve some of the fundamental problems of social justice. For example, is it better to spend educational resources equally on all, or should the less fortunate be given more? Or should more be invested in the more talented, who would provide more benefit to society? Other problems involve unintended consequences, hidden biases of blind choices, and problems similar to those of trolley problems, such as a need to know the circumstances to make an informed moral decision. This is because different people want or need different things. Problems like these have led Rawls' theory of justice to be thought of as a theoretical rather than a practical tool. Yet there are other consequences apart from Rawls' theory being less than a complete solution. One is that Rawls' provision of a social construct underlines the failure of an objectivist justice, and another endorses one of the crucial features of justice noted earlier. That is, Rawls described justice as the first virtue of social institutions. That is, justice must be about the treatment of other individuals or people. And an illustration of the necessary involvement of people in the concept of justice is seen in animal behaviour. For example, if a dog bites us, we don't see it as an injustice for which we seek revenge on the dog. Yet the idea of revenge also raises questions about Rawls' theory of impartial decision making. For example, as a hidden bias, punitive justice has been criticised as a euphemism for revenge. In Nietzsche's version, human suffering is alleviated by finding a guilty perpetrator who is receptive to suffering, or some living thing on which he can discharge his affects in deed or in effigy as the sufferer's greatest attempt at relief or anesthetization, unquote. Nietzsche finds his attempt to alleviate human suffering by blame and self-anesthetization the true physiological causality of ressentiment, of revenge, and of their relatives. That is a different kind of negative states. A more academic interpretation of hurt, anger, offence, and justice is given by psychoanalyst Adam Phillips. He writes that our angers are inarticulate theories of justice. They are articulated, acted out in revenge. Yet there were also underlying moral presuppositions that evoke attitudes of anger or forgiveness. And it is the supposed ethical involvement of other people that produces the offence. It is also the presupposition of a particular ethical or moral framework that creates a problem. And given such, some response is required by the world, by society, or by God to put things right. And that response could be anything: anger, hatred, revenge, justice, or an atoning sacrifice. In most religious perspectives, justice requires a sacrifice in the form of a scapegoat, the Son of God, or personal penance and atonement. The above are sociological and psychological accounts of justice. Without preempting a more philosophical basis for justice, we can also examine its biological roots. One way to do this is to search for naturalist and virtue theory foundations of justice. But this invokes the fallacy of basing moral principles on natural sentiments, even though this practice may sometimes be admirable in applied ethics. Notwithstanding these considerations, studies of macaques have revealed a sense of fairness or relative deprivation that mirrors justice. One study showed a macaque's outrage on being given celery instead of grapes, even throwing it back. Now, the sense of fairness patently exhibited by macaques would not match the complex human concept of justice. Yet it's noticeable that infants also display an acute sense of unmoderated fairness or supposed justice. And it's of ambivalent significance that macaques clearly express such a sense of fairness. Yet fairness is widely set as a foundation of justice by John Rawls and others. It's possible that the concept of justice has been developed beyond its need for a foundation in a sense of fairness. But the primordial origins of the human psyche, revealed by such as Nietzsche and Freud, shed doubt on that. Biology alone cannot be the criterion of moral principles, as instincts like domination and cruelty show. And given these doubts, we stand in need of an explicit account of the concept of justice. Another way in which the concept of justice has been thought to be explained and justified is with the concept of rights. For example, we saw that both Nozick and Rawls held that a just society respects people's rights. Yet this is a particularly American conception of justice that consists almost entirely of rights. But this proliferation of rights further strengthens the suspicion that rights is an anthropocentric concept. Conversely, rights are traditionally grounded in the basic right to life. Yet this was expanded by such as the US Democratic Party platform of 1960 into the following: the right to work, work remuneration, sufficient earnings, selling farm products, fair competition, a decent home, medical care, pensions and education. All these are all desirable objectives, but cannot properly be attributed with the objective status of rights. Animal rights are an example of something we might want, but can't be objectively instantiated. And rights seem to be attributed to such in order to substantiate their value. So in my view, rights are objectified human wants. That is, rights may be highly desirable and indeed good and right, but these rights or wants must be justified in some other way, that is, other than their objectification as intrinsic values. And Jeremy Bentham, although for political motives, similarly describes natural rights as nonsense on stilts. Peter Singer went on to describe the notion of rights as a convenient political shorthand. For the record, Ayn Rand described individual rights as a prodigious feat of political thinking, and Alistair MacIntyre further argues that the idea of human rights didn't exist before 1400. In his book Whose Justice? Which Rationality? MacIntyre also adds to the earlier noted problem of diversity. He argues that there are a number of different and incompatible accounts of rationality that underpin justice. From another context, Tom Holland makes a two-edged argument for the Christian origins of human rights. He writes that the evolution of the concept of human rights derived not from ancient Greece or Rome, but from the canon lawyers of the Middle Ages. But origins in the Middle Ages, when everyone was nominally Christian, isn't a Christian origin. All these considerations support the view that rights and their influence of justice are human inventions. Both Bentham and Hume insisted that natural law and natural rights are unreal metaphysical phenomena. And Mackie's critique of intrinsic value applied to justice as a principle also applies to rights. Going back to John Locke, he held that rights are rational moral principles applicable to the individual. This differed from the Middle Ages view of Aquinas and others that rights are social and are innate and written on our hearts. But as a modern, David Hume held justice to be a human invention, but not one that society can dispense with. That is, the ideas of justice and rights may nevertheless be essential to maintaining social order. But in order to maintain social order, justice and rights may need to be believed to be objective. Yet, like the earlier noted consensus in modern applied ethics, Hume also believed that justice had no place in close personal relationships such as the family. These practices reflect a belief in a natural or organic basis for moral order. Hume thought nature had given us the motives of parental love, benevolence, and generosity. It's notable that Hume's concept of justice doesn't depend on religion, metaphysics, or inherent objectivity, but his faith in social pragmatism and the beneficence of nature is hard to justify today. One criticism is made by Ian Crews is the problem of the missing motive in Hume's theory of justice. Hume does consider sympathy, which is too unspecific, and he can't consider self-love as a motive. He reasons that unrestrained self-love is the primary motive of injustice, so it can't be the motive of justice. Yet Ian Crews holds that Hume's circular argument against motives for justice is a negative argument. He says that Hume argues that the motive that gives just actions the moral quality that they have can't be a concern for one of the moral qualities that they have. But Crews points out that this argues against such a motive, not for a particular motive. This isn't an unexpected outcome, again leading to the problem of what are the foundations of rights and justice. Yet justice is about the fair treatment of others, but the standards of that treatment are culturally relative. This is because what different people want or need will be different for different people. Yet underlying those variations, there's a will to treat other people well that needs explication. And it is with respect to this will to treat other people well or fairly that we can return to Aristotle's notion of justice as a dispositional virtue that judges fairness and produces goodwill. I previously argued that Aristotle's virtue lacks a serviceable concept of value. Yet with such a concept of value, virtue ethics translates into value theory ethics. That is, dispositional virtues can be interpreted as value states. We noted that for Plato and Aristotle, the four main virtues are justice, temperance, prudence and courage. For Aristotle, justice is a moral attitude and hence a value state in relation to another person. Temperance is balance, in contrast to the self-indulgence that indicates a lack of substantive value. Prudence is the practical wisdom of making value choices in ethical situations, and courage has the love and value of self and others that can bear great costs for them. Yet for an explicit account of justice as a concern for the fair treatment of others, we can turn to value theory ethics. Value theory ethics regards morality as the process of reflecting moral valuations back onto the agent, and that reflection of value back onto the agent accounts for the elevating experience of morality. Actions deemed to be moral reflect positive judgments and values back onto the agent, and conversely, actions deemed to be immoral reflect negative judgments. The content of those actions is deliberately unspecific. This is because what is deemed to be moral isn't fixed or definitive, but is subject to cultural relativity. In this way, justice can be defined as a concern for the fair treatment of others expressed in relative terms. I previously presented an extensive value theory argument for the will to treat others fairly. But again, I don't have the space to repeat that argument. In conclusion, the main point of this paper is that the concepts of justice and rights are objectified wants or wishes. And given the alternatives, we might be better off without justice or rights as objective or intrinsic values. To reach that conclusion, we looked at some objectivist concepts of justice and value, such as held by Plato, Aristotle, More, Ronald Dworkin, Robert Nozick, Derek Parfit, and Thomas Nagel. Against these views, we considered arguments against objective value by John Mackey and Ralph Perry. Yet we saw that Isaiah Berlin's pluralism and John Rawls' theory of justice also provided incidental arguments against an objectivist conception of justice. In addition to Rawls' sociological account of justice, we also looked at psychological and biological accounts. Society, psychology, and biology offer practical accounts, but not the foundations of justice that we need. For that, we paradoxically return to the subjectivity of an Aristotelian virtue theory account. But the conceptual framework of virtue theory was interpreted in terms of value theory. That is, the cultural relativity implicit in virtue theory was retained, but virtues were replaced with values. Yet a criticism of this subjectivist value theory of justice could be that no one would deserve anything. That is, objectively, no one deserves to be paid or rewarded for their efforts or punished for their misdeeds. But it's better that they are, in order to preserve social order and the sanity of those within it. In fact, Sapolsky makes the same claim, that no one deserves anything but due to his denial of free will. I also believe that, objectively, no one deserves anything, but because of the subjective basis of justice. And I hold that that subjective basis can be validated by the structures of consciousness and value. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom and meetup.com.